Urban violence continues to be an issue, of course, in some of the country's largest cities where homicide rates continue to climb. In Philadelphia, there have been 164 homicides as of yesterday. That's up 8% from last year, according to its police department. South of Philly, Baltimore City has seen 159 homicides so far this year, according to the Baltimore Sun. And in Chicago, while shootings and violent crimes are down for the first half of the year, the Sun-Times reports there have been more than 240 homicides in the city in 2019 so far. Our next guest is taking a closer look at the effect of urban violence and how we can solve that problem. Thomas Abt joins us now. He's a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and the author of the new book, Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets. Thomas, it's so great to have you here. Got a lot of people who want to get in on this conversation that is so important right now. I do want to point about the city that I'm sitting in right now, on track again, halfway through the year, to set a new low in homicide since the 1950s. They set a record in 2017, could be even fewer this year. New York City is doing something right in that regard. What can these other cities learn from it?
Sure. There's a lot to learn from New York City. The first thing is that I think New York City is doing a lot of what I've recommended in the book in terms of following three fundamental principles. First, focus. Focusing on the people and places that are driving the majority of the violence in any given city. Second, balance. Using both the carrot and the stick. Using enforcement, targeted enforcement, but also widespread prevention and treatment. And finally, fairness. You have to attend to the perceived legitimacy of law enforcement in your communities. New York City has struggled with many of these things, but it has made grudging progress. And lastly, I would point out something that is not comparable to other cities, unfortunately, which is that New York City is an extremely wealthy city and has more money to spend on these issues.
Eddie Glaude, thank you so much for the book, but how do you address this question without falling into the old trap of how we talk about urban violence, that it becomes in some ways a kind of racial dog whistle in our politics, where it is a source of a kind of moral panic that leads to punitive measures? How do we actually address the issue directly and substantively without it triggering this kind of the underside of our politics in some ways?
I think it's such a great question. When the issue of urban violence comes up, you see people either sensationalizing the issue or minimizing the issue. And really, I think the best idea is to simply look at the evidence. And 30 years of social science tells us that urban violence is extremely concentrated among a very small number of people and places in any given jurisdiction. And what that means is that we have to avoid stigmatizing entire communities with this broad brush of dangerousness or violence. Even in the most allegedly dangerous community, the vast majority of people are not violent, and the vast majority of that neighborhood's geography is not violent. So I think that's an important point to keep in mind.
Anand
Giridharadas here. I'm curious what the role of the Black Lives Matter movement and the larger calling attention to police abuses of power, shooting of unarmed people, what effect that influential movement has had on what we're seeing happen in cities around the country?
Sure. I think that, it's impossible to talk about this subject without talking about the ongoing crisis of confidence in the American criminal justice system, and Black Lives Matter figures prominently in that. One of the things that I discovered in the course of my research is when the legitimacy, the perceived legitimacy of the criminal justice system declines in the eyes of the community, that can actually trigger a rise in violence. Because if people don't believe in the system, they won't use it. They won't serve as jurors, they won't testify in court, they won't offer information to the police. And perhaps most importantly, conflicts that they might have resolved by calling the police, they'll now handle themselves. And that can lead to these vicious cycles of retaliation that we see far too often.
Karine?
Hi there, Thomas. This is Karine Jean-Pierre. You talk about predictive policing, and when some folks hear that, they might think of programs like stop and frisk, racial profiling by the police. How do you, which we know disproportionately negatively affects people of color, what do you say to them if that's where they go and that's what they think when you use that word, that phrasing?
Sure. Actually, in the book, I avoid that word specifically because it is so weighted. I do talk about hotspots policing, which the research shows has consistently been able to reduce crime and violence. But I think what's important to understand is that when we're talking about urban violence, sometimes targeted enforcement measures are called for. It's really important that they be really limited to the most dangerous people in a given area, and that we avoid these broad brushes of zero tolerance approaches that really don't distinguish between who's at risk and who isn't in these communities.
Thomas, Walter Isaacson here. We've seen crime, especially violent crime, in some places go down rather dramatically over the past 10, 15 years. I know you talk about a lot of factors. I could do this in your book. But are there other factors that seem almost out of the blue, like the rise of cell phone usage or the change in different types of drugs people are using, that affect the rates of violent crime and may be causing this downward trend we're enjoying at the moment?
Sure. So criminologists have been studying what's known as the Great Crime Decline for now decades, and there are some potential answers, but no one has absolute confidence about what has caused the decline, and except that they're confident that it's not just one thing. So changing drug markets, the decline of the crack wars, improvements in the economy, actually increases in incarceration, while they triggered massive collateral consequences and were far greater than what was necessary, did have a small impact on crime rates. So there's lots of different things. You mentioned technology. Some people mentioned things like lead. All of these things are being studied, but we don't have a conclusive answer.
As Thomas argues, urban violence is solvable. He makes the case in the new book, Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets. Thomas, thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Still ahead on Morning Joe, the Department of Homeland Security's own internal watchdog has released photos showing migrants packed into overcrowded cells in Texas border facilities. Republican Congressman Will Hurd, who represents more of the U.S.-Mexico border than any other lawmaker in Washington, will be our guest. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.